taking on CNN because around the world, media is saying it's a genocide, but CNN is not. They are so stuck in their toxic wisdom of violence and lies that we decided to come and deliver a media violence detox. You have to understand how many lies you have inside of you and cleanse them. So we've done a teach-in. We're saying here we are to help you get to peace inside, to help you detox from all these lies. It's a genocide.
By careful framing, selective omission, and the strategic deployment of a sheen of objectivity, the media has functioned as an actor in the genocide in Gaza. From the BBC to CNN, from New York Times to The Guardian, outlet after outlet has made itself a strategic asset, both for Benjamin Netanyahu's genocidal regime and for the Western powers urgently seeking to maintain the status quo in the region, no matter the cost. The ease with which consumers of news have been able to absorb a narrative involving clear-cut contrasts between terrorists and victims, barbarian chaos and liberal order, bloodthirsty massacres, and the merely incidental damage of the world's most moral army is no accident. Fabrications. The vacuum left by the crushing of attempts to explain the story of Palestinian resistance was quickly filled with manufactured horror, readily accepted by an audience starved of an alternative view. Hamas had, it had been widely reported, beheaded 40 babies. It had, it was said, cooked a child in an oven. Both claims were false, though continued to be amplified by journalists, pundits, and political figures. Claims of widespread systematic sexual assault on October 7th remain largely unsubstantiated, as do the Israeli military's assertions that Hamas uses civilians and civilian infrastructure to shield its operations. Yet they too formed the basis of reports, many now debunked, asserting these claims as facts, using different language to describe Palestinian suffering. A fair study finds that since October 7th, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal have overwhelmingly applied the term brutal to violence committed by Palestinians rather than by Israelis. And that's just one of many examples. In doing so, journalists help justify U.S. support for the assault on Gaza and shield Israel from criticism, particularly in the early months of the onslaught. Ignoring Palestinian voices. At the New York Times and Washington Post, despite efforts to include Palestinian voices, opinion editors have skewed the Gaza debate toward an Israel-centered perspective, dominated by men and among guest writers, government officials. In the first 2 months of the current Gaza crisis, the Times featured the crisis on its op-ed pages almost twice as many times as the Post. But while both papers did include a few strong pro-Palestinian voices, and both seemed to make an effort to bring Palestinian voices close to parity with Israeli voices, their pages leaned heavily toward a conversation dominated by Israeli interests and concerns. Interviews with leaders of groups like Hamas have been rare, meaning Western audiences have been deprived of the necessary context to form informed views on the group's military and political aims and tactics. Taking less interest in Palestinian deaths. The number of Palestinians killed, injured, and displaced by Israel's assault continued to climb as Western journalists failed time and again to challenge Israel's spokespeople on the country's tactics. Officials have been repeatedly allowed to broadcast the myth of the precision of Israel's military operations in Gaza unchallenged. And while Israel's claims and justifications were reported almost daily, noticeably absent were the voices of those coordinating the resistance in Gaza. There have been numerous internal rebellions, leaks, and public criticisms of media news outlets over their anti-Palestinian slant, lodged by journalism professors, reporters, and even their own staff, some of whom have resigned over the coverage. Assuming or communicating parity between a country with an army, air force, navy, and nuclear power backed by the US, Israel, and a resistance group, Hamas. We'd like to bring into focus how this is directly affecting American citizens like yourself and where their hard-earned tax dollars are going. U.S. aid to Israel from 1951 to 2022 totaled $317 billion, making it the largest recipient of American foreign aid since World War II. Most of the aid is provided as grants under the Foreign Military Financing (FMF) program, funds that Israel must use to purchase U.S. military equipment and services. A YouGov poll commissioned by the Center for Economic and Policy Research revealed that a majority of Americans want the U.S. government to stop supplying the Israeli military with weaponry to carry out its brutal assault on Gaza. Even government officials in Congress invoked the Leahy Act, barring assistance to security forces of governments facing credible accusations of rights abuses, to challenge the previous administration, the Biden administration's military aid program for Israel. They proposed that the $14.3 billion to Israel breaches the 1997 landmark law, as the assault on Gaza has overwhelmingly harmed civilians, from military strikes on the territory to the displacement of more than 1 million people from their homes, and a surging humanitarian crisis after Israeli authorities cut water, food, fuel, and electricity supplies. Israel's violations of international law and its impunity. The International Court of Justice, ICJ, a top United Nations court, has ruled that Israel's continued presence in the occupied Palestinian territory is in violation of many international laws, pointing to a wide list of policies, including the building and expansion of Israeli settlements in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, use of the area's natural resources, the annexation and imposition of permanent control over lands, and discriminatory policies against Palestinians. Western governments and much of the international community have long ignored Israel's breaches of international law, effectively granting it impunity. This perceived immunity has allowed Israel to routinely violate international norms with a growing sense of confidence, making such breaches a standard state policy since its inception. Among Israel's numerous international law violations, the most glaring are its state-sanctioned genocide and other war crimes. Such severe breaches would normally provoke concern from the international community and judicial bodies. However, Israel's support from the international community has encouraged it to carry out these violations more openly and audaciously, challenging the global liberal order. Western media versus social media. Americans who get their news primarily from cable are the only people who believe that Israel is not committing a genocide in Gaza, according to a new survey that examined the relationship between attitudes towards the war and attitudes towards the genocide and news consumption habits. The survey puts numbers on trends that have become increasingly apparent. Cable news viewers are more supportive of Israel's war effort, less likely to think Israel is committing war crimes, and less interested in the war in general. People who get their news primarily from social media, YouTube, or podcasts, by contrast, generally side with the Palestinians and believe Israel is committing war crimes and genocide and consider the issue of significant importance. In conclusion, what's been lacking isn't knowledge, but rather the moral courage to report the truth. The truth isn't for the faint of heart. It takes courage to risk alienation by condemning Israel, a Western ally, and courage to put journalistic access to one's own political leaders on the line by condemning their support for the assault. And it takes even more courage to cut a clear path through a colonial history of abuse and occupation that Western audiences have long been primed to reject. But journalism and the truth demands nothing less.
Good job.
Long live the resistance and free Palestine.